Hi everyone. My name is Nick Tuckett. I'm head of R&D for Marmalade, and this is Nick Smith, one of our senior engineers. So this afternoon we're going to tell you a bit about Marmalade's new product called Juice. We'll tell you what it is, why you might want to use it, what you do with it, and we'll give a quick demonstration of it in action. And we also have a case study to take you through of a game that's used Juice that will shortly be appearing in the App Store. So this is what Juice is. It'll allow you to take a native iOS project using the typical iOS frameworks and migrate them quickly and easily to Android and other platforms. So we're calling it a porting ecosystem. So it's a bit more than an SDK. It's a bit of middleware that sort of sits on top of the Marmalade SDK. And it's essentially really just a set of tools and libraries that then give you this capability of migration. So why might you want to use it? Well, top one is the $64,000 question. You can recompile your Objective-C code straight into real code to run on the other device rather than have to spend your time re-implementing in Java or C++. So it can potentially save you a lot of time and effort and avoid you having to sort of go through that process of regenerating your game on another platform and just running to stand still. It produces native code. It's not creating any kind of bytecode or emulated environment. It's integrated with the Xcode IDE, so if you're comfortable with working in that environment, it doesn't push you out of it onto having to do tons of command line work. It's integrated with the Marmalade simulator as it runs on the Mac platform, so you can debug in the way that you're used to. And there's also the potential to go to all the multiple target platforms that the Marmalade SDK supports from a single code base. And if you're canny and you organize it well, you can achieve that. So the key thing is focusing your effort on optimizing and polishing for the new target platforms, not spending your time just redoing your wheels, as it were, just to get your game or your application back to where it was. So in Marmalade Juice, we've got some common iOS framework libraries. Now these are re-implementations of things like core data, core graphics, foundation, core text, to run on the Marmalade SDK. We've got the Clang open source compiler toolchain, which is going to compile your Objective-C code down for the device. We have a static compatibility tool that will take a look at your original iOS project and highlight any areas in the APIs and frameworks it uses that Juice might not yet cover, so it can alert you to any gaps in functionality that we might not yet support. We have a conversion tool that will take your iOS project from Xcode and generate a standard Marmalade MKB file. So from that, you can then generate a Juice Xcode project, or you can build your application from the command line. And we have an integration of the GNU profiler that you can use to profile Juice apps on device as well. Plus a few Marmalade SDK extensions for bits of functionality that we need in Juice to emulate iOS behavior on other platforms that the SDK doesn't necessarily give us out of the box. So if you're going to use Juice, unfortunately that's the wrong title on that slide, this is how you use it, the sort of essential workflow. So what you would do if you were starting a new project with Juice, you'd run the compatibility analysis tool initially, see if you had any gaps with what you were doing compared to Juice. You could then generate your MKB from your initial iOS Xcode project. You'd probably spend a little bit of time after that tuning and extending that MKB, possibly to add some custom build steps to convert assets. You'd then make your Juice Xcode project from that through our tool, and then you enter the main loop of development. You can then build, implement functionality, fix things up, test, debug, optimize, and rinse and repeat that process until you're ready to actually ship. So at this point, if he's ready, I will hand over to Nick for a quick demo.
Sure. Okay, so as you can see, this was a very, very last-minute attempt to set this demo up. I didn't realize I had a meeting that overran right into this. So this is very much like seat of pants. This could go horribly wrong, but we shall see. So what I'm going to do is basically show a simple kind of existing game that we grabbed ran through Juice and then built and ran and pushed to a device. To give a little kind of, well, just to kind of sort of reiterate what Juice is doing. So you've got an original Xcode project, you've got some Objective-C code using some iPhone APIs, you might use Interface Builder to build your UIs from UIKit. What Juice does initially is it just converts the iOS project into a Juice project. So it scans the Xcode project file and builds a regular Marmalade MKB project file that just has a few settings set to use Juice rather than regular Marmalade. But it doesn't change your code at all, and you're still using Xcode, you can still use Interface Builder to play with UIs. It's just now you're working with a Juice project rather than an iOS one. And a sort of whole kind of look at the toolchain is a bit like this. So in the middle there, that's like a regular Marmalade project. But as well as having access to the Marmalade APIs, there's also our version of iOS frameworks. So basically, when you use some iOS actual API code, it'll just build against some libraries that we provide. And those are all open source, and you can edit them and add stuff to them if you want. And then it still uses the regular Marmalade deploy tools to build a single binary and to push that out to devices. So we've only really been sort of actively targeting Android at the moment, but there's nothing stopping you building an LG TV version or a Tizen version, and so on. So I'm going to switch to the Mac and show you a demo. Okay, so basically, this is what Juice looks like. So I've got a regular Marmalade SDK installed here. I'm using a 6.3 build, and the reason it says _Juice is because at the moment we have a slightly different build of the SDK that basically has extra toolchain stuff put into it. But eventually that will just roll back into the regular Marmalade SDK. And then Juice itself is basically a GitHub repository, so you can see some Git files where I've pulled it down. We've got Chameleon and Cocatron, which are basically implementations of UIKit, and then a lot of the core iOS frameworks, the Objective-C runtime, some tools like a profiler, and there's a tutorial here called Puff Puff. So this is basically a game you can get on the iPhone store. You play as a fish and use the accelerometer and stretch controls to guide the fish through a maze of deadly undersea things. The reason we picked it is because they put it up for free on GitHub for people to download and play around with and do what they wanted with. So we downloaded the Xcode project, and this is basically literally the actual Xcode project from there with no changes at all. So to prove that, I could fire it up. So this will just be using the regular Apple toolchain, regular looking iPhone project, set it to the simulator. It's got Cocos 2D, Objective-C version included as source. It's got some C++ and Objective-C code dotted through it. It uses UIKit for its menus fairly minimally. And that should build and run. And it's going to run in the iPhone simulator. You've got the regular iPhone controls, obviously. I can't really demonstrate it very well as a game because the iPhone simulator doesn't actually support accelerometer, so I can't really play it. But just to prove that this is an actual regular app with nothing odd done to it. Give it a second. Let it rotate. So yeah, this is Puff Puff. It's nothing too exciting, but it uses quite a few different sort of core bits of iOS SDK stuff, uses OpenGL via Cocos 2D, has menus built with UIKit, and so on. So I'll kill that. So at the moment, the conversion thing is just a script, basically. So if I switch into, it's quite hard with one hand, to the Juice folder, tutorials, Puff Puff. Oh yeah, one thing to show quickly, actually, I ran the one of the analysis scripts on. So this basically, those dots there is basically, it was running the actual Clang compiler, finding all of the API calls within the project, and then checking them against whether there is an existing implementation of that API. And a bunch of these are false positives. So these ones are all basically things that are so small it assumed they weren't implemented. So it's not a super polished tool yet. And the only ones these are locking and that stuff, those are protocols, so you don't actually implement them. The only real ones are this version of Juice doesn't have OpenAL support. So it's just found all of the OpenAL functions that get called. So you won't hear any sound in the demo, basically. Back to here, so we have Xcode to MKB, does what it sounds like, converts your Xcode project to an MKB one, so I'll just point it at Puff Puff Xcode project. Done. And basically, it's built an MKB file. It's copied the data from the resources folder to a regular Marmalade data folder. And the reason for that is it could just point to the original folder, but you might want to make some changes like switch from one texture compression to another to support different devices. And I'll now just open that up with as a regular project. So it hasn't changed any of the files at all. It's just literally scanned the files, built an Xcode project, built an MKB project. So this is now a Marmalade project. You'll see the usual Marmalade x86 debug release, deploy tool option. Over on the left here, this is basically iOS as a sub-project. So it's got Marmalade system dependencies, but it's got the actual source for our version of UIKit, our version of core graphics, that kind of stuff. Objective-C itself, the ellipse runtime, and you can edit that and it'll rebuild it like a regular Xcode sub-project. So you can edit that, hit build for puff, it'll build the Cocotron part, build puff and run. It's got somewhere down here, the whole of Cocos 2D is source still, and then your game class. So I guess I could breakpoint some bits that will get hit, like eaten by shark ought to get hit if we get hit by a shark, and so on. So basically, if I just pick puff x86 and run it now, it's just like a Marmalade project. It's building a single binary. It's using Clang now rather than GCC. So, but same as usual, x86 binary get produced, and then the simulator will launch it. You'll see one deliberate error when this starts up. So puff is basically designed just to run in landscape, and it actually uses a kind of a fairly old-fashioned way of doing portrait via landscape on iOS. So when the app starts up, I've got the simulator set to portrait, so it'll just be black. Give it a second. Oh, and here it's finding, so because I've got a debug build on, basically it's set to fire asserts whenever it hits an iOS API that isn't implemented. So this is basically the OpenAL stuff that I said isn't in this version of Juice. So, but what's nice is it'll tell you that, so you know, oh, I better implement that, or I better ask someone at Marmalade to implement that. I'm just going to ignore it for now, and I'll just switch this guy to landscape. So let's go with some kind of Android type resolution like that. And that's the game. And the same as a Marmalade game on desktop, you can put breakpoints in, you can step through. I won't bother showing that now though. And for a device build, basically just build for GCC ARM, run the deploy tool, plug into a device and go. And I don't know, Nick, if you've got a...
I have the device with me, but
yeah.
I don't have a USB cable.
I might have a USB cable, hang on. Basically building the whole of Cocos 2D, because I've never run this before. So there we go. But exactly the same as any regular Marmalade project. I've put Android. I think I've got all the drivers installed, but you never know. Is it connected?
Yes.
Yeah, looks good. ADB might crash. That's not our fault.
No, I don't know if you can see it. Should be running.
Yep, it's running. Yeah. So that's basically it. And puff is a bit of like we picked a thing we knew would run. So you know we support Cocos 2D really well. All of the bits of the iPhone API that it uses are all implemented in Juice so far. A real-world project will always have some gaps in Juice that someone needs to fill, but typically we think it already covers a good like 80+% of most code bases, and because Juice is an open source project, we're encouraging developers to implement those bits and push them back out to other developers. And Nick's now going to talk you through an actual real-world game that we've done to show you sort of like the reality of porting.
Thank you, Nick. So as Nick says, out in the real world, there are a few games now starting to use Juice. So we have Tap Paradise Co. from Pocket Gems. That's on the Google Play Store now. And coming shortly is Kingdom Clash from Storm 8. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we went through with the process of taking Storm 8 from iOS over to Android. I was hoping to be able to show you a quick demo of it. Unfortunately, it worked at lunchtime, but now it refuses to connect to the game server for some reason, so I'm afraid I can't show you that. But there are a few screenshots there. So it's a 2D isometric game. There's no actual 3D rendering in this, using the kind of common iOS frameworks you'd expect. A few of those listed on the screen there. It's written majority in Objective-C++ with some C++ code as well. Not so much pure Objective-C. It's recently shipped on iOS worldwide in the last month or so, and it's quite a sizable code base. I mean, it's comparably bigger than the Puff Puff code base. And there's a good chunk of this code that Storm 8 uses their base engine for a number of games. So not only do we have to do the specific port, we have to be careful about the reuse side of things as well. I think I went one too far there, apologies. So the team who actually worked on this, right at the start, they had no familiarity with the game code base, but they had some familiarity with the Marmalade SDK and Juice. And the goal was to do the port, but more importantly, this was a driver for us to improve and extend the Juice functionality and prove it out in the real world. And down the bottom there, there's an idea of what the time frame was. So the main development was really done in August and September of this year using that team. So it was a relatively quick operation. The split was about 65% of our effort went on extending and improving Juice, and about 35% of the effort went on the actual porting of the game itself. So this is the main areas that we actually had to do some work on, mostly across the game side of things. So we had to make some adjustments on text input. The keyboard functioned fairly differently to the iOS, so we made use of the Marmalade IME extension to sort that one out. There were a few UI layout issues we had, mostly because the font rendering didn't quite exactly match what happened on iOS, so we had to make a few tweaks here and there. In order to get performance up, we needed to cache various assets as we loaded them, like the nib files and the images. Juice allows us to do this, so we just basically configured and tuned that. Asset file formats, so there were, depending on the device, certain formats aren't supported. So for example, we had to convert PVR compressed textures into Storm 8's internal format, as opposed to keeping the compressed texture format for maximum compatibility across a range of devices. And also the audio file format as well was another one we had to convert over to WAV files. Clang threw a few clangers at us as well. The open source compiler has a few bugs in that you wouldn't kind of expect in a commercial compiler, so we've had to make a few workarounds for those and are aiming to get those actually fixed for the public release of Juice. A bit of ICF file settings, tunings needed to get things correct for various devices. Orientation handling, there was some difference between the base orientation that the game assumed on iOS and the base orientation that Marmalade gave us. So we had to sort of provide a slightly different code path in the game to transform touch coordinates, for example. Back button handling, obviously iOS doesn't have that, so we had to implement some functionality there. The bare minimum is to prompt the user if they want to quit the game, which is what we put in. Bug fixing, though this was a shipped game on iOS, there were still bugs in it. There were a few Android and Juice specific ones, but we also ran into a few that were common with the iOS project as well. So it was a very real experience from that point of view. So we helped them improve the iOS version at the same time as doing this. Server-side tweaks needed to be made. Of course, that's not related to Juice, but it's something you have to be aware of if you have an online game. And as I mentioned before, we went through and improved and extended bits of Juice functionality, including things like the audio, the font rendering, the web view we have, and we provided an implementation of StoreKit to work with the Google Play Store as well. So looking ahead from that, where is Juice now? Now we've finished that, and where is it going to go next? So we're currently in our sort of pre-release state, and we're moving into making this into a proper product to release early next year as part of the SDK, the main Marmalade SDK. So we're focusing on Android right now because that's our biggest bang for our buck in terms of the benefit it brings. But as Nick mentioned before, there is no fundamental technical barrier for using Juice to port iOS games onto other platforms, but there obviously are going to be some particular challenges depending on those platforms. Our licensing for this isn't yet confirmed, but we will obviously announce that as soon as it is. And across the features that we have, the APIs that you implement, we have a fairly major set of implementations in Foundation, Core Data, Core Foundation, Core Graphics, Core Image, OpenGlass, Quartz Core, and the Facebook SDK. And we have sort of key parts of AV Foundation, Grand Central, Dispatch, Core Text, UI Kit, Media Player, and as I mentioned before, StoreKit for the Google Play Store. But we're going to obviously post-release do more work, so we can add some more features in based on priorities. So we'll be looking at, as Nick mentioned, was a gap there, OpenAL, we'll get GLES 2 in there, full ARC support, Xcode 5, and say, for example, putting the Amazon store support into StoreKit as well. And obviously, with people out there using it, I'm sure there will be feedback, so we'll obviously work on improving it based on that. We're obviously going to have play a bit of catch-up as well with Apple when they make changes to frameworks and deprecate old ones and introduce new ones. And we'll possibly also look at, as I say, more platforms, and also look at potentially having Windows as a host platform for developing on as well, because that's obviously a capability we have in the SDK, but obviously we've been focusing on Xcode for the time being. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask us in a moment or two, or ask us throughout the rest of the event today, or drop an email to hello@marmalademail.com. And thank you very much for your attention.